Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to let people drift in, take their virtual seats. So thanks for your patience. We're looking forward to getting started. Hi, everyone. If you're just coming in, we're just allowing for a few minutes to allow folks to come on by. Thank you. We're looking forward to getting started. Thank you again. If you are just stepping in, we're going to give just 2 or 3 more minutes to allow people to come on in. One more minute, folks. We're just letting people, we're coming in to settle in. All right. I think we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Swarns. I'm a journalism professor here at NYU and chair of our department's diversity committee. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to this conversation tonight, Truth, Objectivity, and Journalists of Color. This conversation could not be more urgent. All across our industry and in our classrooms here at NYU, journalists, professors, students are wrestling with this question of objectivity, this journalistic practice often described as impartial, unbiased investigation of the facts. As many of you know, this was once embraced as our industry standard, but it is being challenged, particularly by younger journalists. Many of you know of Wes Lowry, the Pulitzer Prize winner, and these journalists are saying that objectivity, as traditionally practiced, fails to meet the needs of a society that's increasingly beset by racism and anti-democratic forces. But the truth is that our journalism community is pretty deeply divided on this issue. And this was made clear recently by what some might describe as the dueling op-eds from 2 former executive editors of the Washington Post, Marty Baron and Leonard Downey, who offered different takes on the question. And we're going to be tackling this issue tonight with the leaders of the New York affiliates of 3 national journalism organizations, and I'm thrilled to introduce them to you. Benita Sostre is an Emmy Award-winning producer at CBS and the president of the New York affiliate of the National Association of Black Journalists. Welcome, Benita.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Kiara Alfonseca is a race and culture reporter and producer for ABC News, Good Morning America, and 538, and the vice president of the New York affiliate of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. Kiara, so happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
And Cody G. Sheridan Millar is a broadcast engineer at Salem Media and a freelance transportation reporter, and the vice president of the New York affiliate of the Asian American Journalists Association. Welcome, Cody.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, so just housekeeping, we're going to talk for a bit, have a bit of a conversation here, and then we're going to take your questions. So please, as we're speaking, pop your questions into the Q&A as the discussion is going on so that we have them ready. And for now, let's jump right in. As I mentioned, and as all of us here know well, objectivity was once considered the industry standard. And I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about why is that being challenged, do you think? Should it be challenged? And is objectivity a goal that we should be striving for? I'm hoping that each of you can take a turn on that one.
I can go first. Again,
be
hi everyone. I'm Kiara. Yes, I think this is a really, really great question, just because if we don't start questioning how our industry functions and who it functions for, we'll never get better, we'll never grow. So I'm very excited to have this conversation. And I think in my reporting, it's been more about fairness than objectivity. I think for a long time, our industry has kind of let people's opinions go unchecked, or has given a platform to, hate, bigotry, what have you, in the name of objectivity. And so, and in the name of like having both sides, just to contribute to the debate. And so kind of for example of things that I've come up with recently, people say that trans people don't exist. People say that climate change isn't real, or that systemic racism doesn't exist, or, an election is invalid without having the proof or evidence, right? And so I think when we kind of are faced with those kinds of opinions and those kinds of comments, we often disrespect our audiences and also fail them if we're letting those go unchecked, or not unpacking that truth that is kind of the main pillar of our industry. And so yeah, I guess it's like, especially when we're reporting on marginalized people, I just think it's so important that what we're checking for is the truth, especially when we think, those interviewees or those, characters might not be telling that truth. And so I think it's just really important to question, is there even another side in many cases? So it's definitely something that I think about story by story, especially covering race and culture. But yeah, it's a tough question.
Mm-hmm. Benita, Cody, any thoughts there? Objectivity is something we should be striving for? Thoughts about why it's being challenged in this moment?
I mean, I think we should be objective. I think that's why we are journalists. We are here because we're telling both sides, and the other side might not be something that we necessarily agree with, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be told. Our audience is everybody. I work at CBS News. I also work for the Race and Culture Unit at CBS, and we strive to tell those stories which show both sides of things. We did a documentary where we talked to voters on both sides. We talked to the Republicans who felt one way. We talked to Democrats who felt one way as well. And we wanted to share both sides. And I feel that fairness is important. So it's, we're sharing both sides of that. And it might not be our belief system or something that we think about personally, but it is fair to share both those sides of things and be objective in that, and to try to find the best person on each side. So it might not be the person who is like saying, like something absolutely far-fetched that absolutely is 100% not true or real. So there might be someone who is a more objective, more fair voice that we can use to tell the other side of things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And going off of that, I feel like a lot of times people attempt to equate objectivity as needing to remove yourself entirely from your story. And I personally am of the belief that we can't separate the person, the reporter, from a story, because whether as much as we try to mitigate bias or whatnot, we all have our own lived experiences which influence how we approach angles and how we approach with tact, how we interview our sources, look at different situations and solutions. And so figuring out how we can actually use that as a benefit, and that, yes, I do have these experiences, that is not a negativity. That is something that actually empowers me to be a better reporter and have greater credibility as someone who's experienced those things.
Yeah, one of the arguments, in fact, that's made in the critique of objectivity is that it privileges the perspective of white journalists. People argue that the views of white journalists are, in the traditional view, are accepted as neutral, and the views of journalists of color are often viewed as biased. And I was wondering, do you think that's true? And given that conundrum, kind of jumping off what you were saying, Cody, do you think that young journalists of color can and should bring their life experience and point of view to their reporting?
Yeah, definitely. I think knowing when and where to kind of add the additional lens to your reporting, there are times where it can benefit the story to actually include direct like cultural reporting into a thing. But there's also times having that included, especially when it feels like we're at a time where that having your identity as part of your reporting may not be as accepted in the mainstream. So figuring out the balance of that, like, would it be better to have that nuance in the reporting, or is it going to have greater impact if I don't have that? So that's something that we as individuals and working with your editorial team need to make those judgment calls of when is the right place to do this.
Yeah, Kara, how about you? Since you're actually, you're reporting on these issues, how do you balance that yourself in your reporting?
Yeah, I guess my first thought is just that, newsrooms for so long have been predominantly white, male, cisgendered, straight, and that has shown in our coverage for so long, which is why we're having this conversation, right? I mean, communities of color and queer folks have had to find their news about them, news that is authentic to their stories, somewhere else other than mainstream media, because we've been failing them in terms of not just coverage but also how we cover them. And you're seeing that a lot with the conversation going around now with the trans community, for example. And there will be articles about trans healthcare with no trans people actually in it, right? And then you'll have those both sides, but none of the people who are deeply impacted by that legislation have their say in this. And so I guess in that way, especially with story finding and news gathering and adding perspective to whatever breaking news is going on out there, I think thinking through your identity, or not even just your identity, but the identity of lens, has been something that I've just found so particularly helpful. Every time there's something like a shooting or any police brutality, any issue that we have, like gun violence, for example, I'm looking at it through the lens of identity, and I feel that's where I found the richest stories, just because, as Cody had mentioned, your background, your life experiences inform so much and kind of can help you find those stories that haven't been told yet, especially when we think about, again, how newsrooms have not looked very diverse for so long.
Yeah, Benita, what do you think? And is there a professional risk potentially to doing that? Actually, you can look at it in both ways. Is there a professional risk to bringing that lens, to putting yourself out there in that way? Is there a risk to transparency and to credible and powerful journalism if we don't? I don't know.
I would say that depends on where you work. If you work in a place that's more advocacy journalism, then absolutely you should, have your opinion and put it out there. And that really depends on where you are and what their guidelines are in your newsroom. So that's something to be aware of. In my newsroom where I am, they tell us, we are journalists. So if there's a big political campaign or something like that going on, I'm not going to put my point of view or my perspective on social media, because then how can I be objective if I'm calling, someone from this side or someone from the other side? If they already know if I'm putting that on social media, they can see exactly what I stand for, and they might not want to talk to me. So for me, it's important for me to remain in the middle. I don't share those kinds of things on social media. It's not something that I put out there. But if you're writing for a paper or digital platform or whatever platform you're on, and that's what it is, that's what you guys do, you share your opinion and you're part of the story, then absolutely. But if you're in a newsroom where you're not meant to be part of the story, I wouldn't share those things. I don't think those would be beneficial to your career.
Right. And kind of tapping into what Kiara was saying, sometimes as journalists of color, we bring our perspective to the table when when we're not putting ourselves in the story. I think lots of us do that a lot of the time. And it occurs to me that it's important to do that, and might be worth mentioning what can be lost when we don't do that. I have a colleague who was reporting, when I was a full-time correspondent at the New York Times, who was reporting on a corrupt police officer, someone who had been accused of fixing a murder case. And this colleague of mine who was Latina told me and told other colleagues that, she thought there were more cases. She thought there probably wasn't just one. And a colleague said to her, well, how are you going to do that? How are you going to report that out? Are you going to go out to Brooklyn, in these poor neighborhoods and interview drug dealers and their families? Because these were drug murders that this guy she thought was fixing. And she said, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Actually, I'm going to go out and I'm going to talk to these people who are accused of drug dealing and these cases. And and that's what I'm going to do. And, because she felt that that was an important line of coverage, and that those were sources who could provide information, critical information. She went and did that, and ended up, her reporting ended up, she won a Polk Award and ended up overturning a bunch of cases. So I do think that that's something to think about. And it brings us to the question of who is a source, right? People on the receiving end of the criminal justice system were often viewed as biased, right? Not reputable sources. But in recent years, we've seen over and over again with these cases of these terrible cases of police brutality, that a healthy skepticism of folks who have kind of for a long time been viewed as kind of excellent sources should be kind of viewed with a bit of skepticism. What do you think about that in terms of objectivity, in terms of who are our sources? Who are we looking to? Who do we, I don't know, Kiara's got a hand up. Okay. And folks, I want to remind you, folks in the audience, please, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A as you're thinking about them as we're talking, because we're going to be coming to you soon. Okay, go ahead, Kiara.
Yeah, I think I just had another point on the last conversation that we were having, just about life experiences. And I think a key point of, bringing life experience to the reporting is not about going on the website, typing up your opinion and shipping it off, but rather, for example, when I was in Uvalde, Texas, after the Robb Elementary shooting, I'm Latina. I already know that there's a lot of mental health stigma in the community. And so that was one of my first things, which is okay, this predominantly Hispanic community is now dealing with trauma. And then, we were looking at, okay, well, all these mental health centers are coming in, but I'm they're coming in from out of town. So are they predominantly white? And of course I talked to all the people who were coming into town, and they're yeah, a lot of people don't trust us because we do not look like them. And so I think that's what I mean when I say letting it inform your reporting, is just kind of thinking outside of the box and using your identity to inform where you go. Kind of like how you mentioned, it's thinking about sources outside of that typical box of okay, let me check a national organization, a police department, and all of these, legislators, et cetera. And I think that's an important aspect of it, of expanding your network, and getting on the ground and using your identity to also inform where and who is valuable in these discussions. Yeah, I think that's really important.
Yeah. Yeah. Cody, Bonita, any thoughts on that, and on sources, who we reach out to, whose voices get heard in these in the reporting that we're working on?
I think it's important to reach out to everyone if they're relevant to the story. You can never have enough information. Like, I don't know why anyone would stop, would say, well, oh no, I can't reach out to that person. First, you're going to reach out to that person, because that's how you tell a well-rounded story. So I think for your example of the criminals or the drug dealers, whoever they are, the family members, yeah, they're the victims, or if they're the ones getting arrested, or however the source is, yeah, you should talk to them. They're a pivotal part of the story. So yeah, I think you can get your sources from anywhere, and they can be anyone, but you should also have those, as Kiara mentioned, the national source, and like your source from these well-known places. Of course you get the police or the fire department or the city council or whoever it is. Yeah, you get those, but in order to tell a full story, you have to talk with everyone, and then take it from there. If their stories match up, like, do your homework, do your research. If they're saying they were out at this time and this and that happened, like, go and see if you can get video from that time. If they are in front of some place to confirm that this is what's happening, like, listen to people, but then verify. I always know you need two sources. Like, if someone says something, I want someone else or something else to back that up, a text message, something that proves that what they're saying is correct, a Facebook message, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. And Benita, I think you mentioned a couple of minutes ago about social media and caution, right, with social media. This has been something else that has kind of come up in some of these discussions about journalists, young journalists, journalists of color, voicing their opinions on social media. And the rules that many of our organizations have, saying nope, can't do that, right? We don't want if you're going to be reporting on politics, we don't want you pounding the table saying I hate the Democrats, or I hate like that's not useful. But there are people, younger people, who say that actually that is not that they don't think that that's productive. And obviously, and there are news organizations, right, who are saying, okay, listen, we're going to come at this from, listen, we're a progressive news organization. That's where our leanings are. We're going to be rigorous and fair. But here's who I am, and I can do both. What do you guys think about that? And what would you tell, our young journalists here, journalism students here, who hear something and immediately jump to the to the keyboard?
I would say tell it to your friends, tell it in a text message, don't put it on social media, because you probably won't be working at that news organization for forever. And you might want to go someplace that's different, that has a different perspective. And the first thing anyone does with anybody is look them up. And those tweets or social media, whatever it is, no matter how private you think your account is, it's not. And even if you think you're just sharing it with one person, that, it always comes back out. So I would say just talk about it with your friends in the text or on the phone, but I wouldn't put it on social media. But that's just my 2 cents.
Should journalists Kiara's got a thought there. Cody, I want to hear from you too. I want to add to that, not just posting on social media. What about registering to vote? Should you vote? Can you go to as a person of color, can you go to a protest about violence, about a Black Lives Matter protest, police brutality, whatever? What about those kinds of things too? My students often say this profession, it wants to muzzle me. How do you guys think about that?
Cody, I'll let you go. I've been talking too much.
Yeah, no, totally. I'm trying to process that a little bit, because I feel like, as someone who definitely falls in the young journalist camp, I do tend to have kind of those leanings of, sometimes I'm tempted to publish things that are very much openly leaning towards one way. And then I kind of have to remove myself from the situation for a second and be like, who does this benefit? Because in my actual coverage, not my personal beliefs, will this alienate viewers or listeners that will actually benefit from future coverage? And that's something that we always have to be cognizant about, is who do we alienate when we decide to cover something or to not cover something. And my personal philosophy is very much about transparency. So being open about, okay, there's this issue, these are who it like impacts, and these are, if we do this thing, this is how this may unintentionally or intentionally impact another issue. And kind of similar to looking at identity in your reporting, there's intersectionality in all different areas of coverage. So kind of being mindful of that, and what are what actually happens if we decide to publish, not publish, choose one angle versus another. I'm just being mindful of that.
Mhm. Kiara?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. Should you vote? Yes, you should vote. You're still a person who's impacted by laws. So please vote. I think in terms of social media, protests, I've never been allowed to go to protests under any organization I've been in. So I take that with, as you will. But I think when it comes to social media, I think the worth of posting your opinion for strangers on the internet is so little. And I found that it's more productive to just sometimes I just tweet out my own work and let that speak for itself. When the shooting happened in Louisville, I just updated an article, which is more than 11,500 people killed in gun violence so far in 2023. And I was like, that article speaks for itself, right? It talks about gun violence, kind of dissects it. And I don't need to give my opinion on gun violence, on gun control. It's just, here's a news event, here's a perspective on a news event, here's kind of a different angle, a different take on it. And so just kind of letting my work speak for itself can kind of, I guess, get that itch out of wanting to say something. So that could be a really good tool of just go on the internet and maybe tweet a news article so more people get informed about what's going on rather than, tweeting something very angrily when you want to.
So one thing that's come up again, sometimes with this critique of objectivity, it's kind of the idea, the critique is that, an objective view is a privileged white view. That's the critique, right? And so sometimes journalists feel and ask the question, can a Black journalist cover the killing of George Floyd fairly? Can an Asian American journalist cover an anti-Asian hate crime fairly? Can a Muslim journalist cover a bombing of a mosque fairly, impartially? Should they? Obviously, journalists of color are covering all of these things, but these questions sometimes come up, and I'm wondering, in a way, sometimes that they don't come up for white journalists who are covering things, and I'm wondering how you feel about those kinds of questions. And I'm going to you, Cody.
I mean, what comes to mind is when there's definitely a privilege to being able to report on certain issues and when not to. And when you're in a situation where your editors or your assignment editors are like, is this a conflict of interest? I kind of raise, we should be asking, is this happening to other people with similar conflicts of interests? And also, is this an opportunity for us to maybe step back where, yes, I am extremely biased in one way and I don't feel like I could adequately report on this in a way that's fair to the issue itself. So being mindful on that, and kind of also using it as an ability to control your bandwidth of, am I emotionally available for the story? That sometimes we're not always have the privilege to be able to take that step and be like, listen, I cannot do the story. So that's one unintended benefit, I guess, from the that double standard of, is this a conflict of interest?
Benita, what do you think?
I think any journalist can cover any story. I don't think race or your background has anything, where it should be brought up. As journalists, we leave our personal lives at the door or at our virtual door when we're at work. Yes, you can be a Black person and cover the horrendous things that have been happening during for George Floyd, the social justice movement in general, and being a fair journalist and remembering that you can talk to both sides. I've covered Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery. I've spoken with both Derek Chauvin's attorneys. I spoke with and have done interviews with Ben Crump numerous of times. I can do those both fairly and tell a fair story and showcase both sides of things. So I don't think that my background has anything to do with me being able to go into whatever story I'm working on and be fair, talk with both sides of the story, tell both sides of that story, because the story tells itself. I don't need to put my own personal opinion in it or my background or where I'm from to tell what the story is. It's very clear. There was video of George Floyd. I didn't need to say, oh, I can't believe this happened to a Black man. You can watch the video and see what exactly happened. So I think I'm able, and most journalists are able to cover anything.
Kiara?
Yeah. I agree. I think, if you're a journalist, you should be able to cover any story. I 100% agree on that fact. And I think it's a question that gets posed to journalists of color that would never be posed to white journalists. And especially considering white journalists also come with identities. You can be, again, like you can be poor, you can be queer, you can be disabled. And so, I think it's important that all of us kind of come from this place of, being considerate of our identities, of our unconscious biases, of, how these things play into our view of the world at all times, and to be cognizant of that. But yeah, I think anyone, a good journalist should be able to report on all of these things 100% fairly. Yes.
Yeah, in fact, it's one of the gifts of the job, right? Being able to, I think all of us know that, being able to step into someone else's shoes, into someone else's life that that's a place that you know nothing about. It's kind of one of the amazing privileges of doing this work. Okay, another thing. So for a long time, journalists being objective meant you being careful about language, particularly about language involving race. We talked, for instance, if a politician, particularly with people in power, right? So if a politician said something that was racist, the language we might use is, we would say it's racially charged or racially insensitive. Or also it wasn't just race that we did this with too. It was if a politician, for instance, said something that wasn't true, we said made a misleading statement, or we use that kind of language, and that was viewed as objective. Obviously, those kinds of practices and traditions have changed. I'm wondering what you think about that. Is that a good thing? And would you say, and some would say it is, and some would say it isn't, would you say it would be objective to say, former President Trump was a racist? How do you think about using terms? Because more often now than before, we are saying that politician lied, that statement was racist. Is that a good change, or is that leaving objectivity behind?
I think one thing with that to be considerate of would be, would we afford the same courtesy to someone who is not in that public eye, who is not in that position of privilege and power? If the answer is yes, totally fine to use that language that's up to you, your editors, how you want to tackle that, what your style guides say. However, if it's something where outside of the context of that specific person's position, would they be called out? Would they be given? And that's kind of where you kind of have to make that decision of, do I, as the reporter, interject information and assertions, or do I let quotes from other sources that say that that claim is true, that someone is a liar or racist, and let the source make the assertion, and me as the reporter, the opinion being just choosing to let that be in the article or the story.
Okay. Reminder to those of you who are out there, please put your questions in the Q&A. Bonita, Kiara, what do you think about that kind of language and how we use it?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. I think I would stay away from putting a moral judgment on someone's character, like saying someone is racist. That's just me. But I think when we talk about like statements or comments or an action being racist, I think that's very fair game. It's like, for example, if you say they should go back to their country, it's like, yes, that is a racist statement. And what do we gain from saying that? It's racially charged? It's like, no, that's racist. Or we did a story today about a representative who called trans people mutants and demons, and it was like, yeah, that's anti-trans. That's not, there's no other way to call it. And so, yeah, I think that I don't think it necessarily leaves objectivity behind. I think it's that point of truth telling, right? It's like, what are we telling the truth if we don't say it's racist, if we don't call attention to the impact that it would have, or its impact on people of color or trans people, whatever it might be. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that too. It's facts. At the end of the day, if someone is saying something that can be fact checked and it's not the truth, then there's nothing wrong with saying, we, so and so said this thing, we checked the facts, and because of XYZ thing, that was incorrect. There are a lot of different organizations that do like a fact check with certain things that are being said. So I don't see a problem with checking the facts and saying if they said something, but it isn't factually correct.
So lately I've encountered students who are sometimes reluctant to interview the police, for instance, who don't want to interview conservatives, who are concerned about feeling like these perspectives, I think, I don't think it's going to be, accurate. I don't think I'm going to agree with it. Why, Professor Swarns, are you saying that I have to make that call? What do you think about that? Isn't there a danger here with that? And I'm not talking about both siderism here, where the concern that people have about, okay, you have, the white supremacist here who, just, ran someone over with a car, and the activist here, and you're quoting both. I'm not talking about that, but just saying literally, I don't want to make that call. And I don't necessarily want to include that voice. And I'm wondering, if there's a concern about losing, the sense of the importance of making sure we're hearing, voices, whether we agree with them or not.
I think the core of our job as reporters is that we need to be doing have our due diligence. We need to be investigating all aspects of all sides as much as possible, whether that's the direct parties involved or the people who are unintentionally involved in this conflict. Because at the end of the day, everything kind of boils down to a conflict. That's where we find our stories, and there's an issue, let's find it. And so I don't see it, like, you kind of have to do that. It may be uncomfortable, however, it's one of those things where you are doing that so then other people may not have to. And this is kind of where it becomes very dangerous, especially with this political climate where everyone is kind of ostracized or forced to go to one side or the other. How can we start bridging the gap and having people communicate with each other? That by not doing our due diligence and not communicating with sides or stories or angles that may not be comfortable to us as reporters, we're doing a disservice to everyone.
Agreed. Cody said it best. I mean, all that. Yeah. We're journalists. We are here to tell both sides of the story. We can't just say, ill, I don't like the police, I'm not going to talk to them. That's your personal feeling. I said before, you leave that at the door. You're trying to tell a story. You're trying to be fair. And you're not going to talk to the police officer who was involved in whatever. You're going to talk to the very nice PIO person, the public information officer, who is just like the public relations person at the police station, who is used to dealing with reporters. They are very friendly. They'll call you back. They'll get you a statement when you need it. Those are people who, number one, you should make friends with so that you get on their list, so that you know when something happens, you don't have to go find them. You'll already be on their list so that you get the statement and you have it already. All those official types are types that you always have to talk to. And for any story, there shouldn't be that's a bias. If you're saying, oh, I don't want to talk to that type of person or the person at that organization, it's like, well, how are you telling a full story? If not, you're telling a blog post if you just want to tell your side of things. And that's not what journalists do.
Sometimes it's not just the nice PIO, right? Sometimes it is, the white supremacist. Sometimes it is the politician, the anti-trans politician. Sometimes it is, my husband and I spent time in South Africa reporting, I was reporting on, Afrikaners who would be entirely opposed to me and my position there, right? Sometimes it's not just the functionaries, it's people who might really hold views that are kind of abhorrent to you and to many people, right? We still do that. Kiara?
Yeah, I have so many thoughts.
Many, let's hear it.
Just as someone who talks to scary people all the time, you just gotta do it. I love you all. I can't see you. You gotta do it. Suck it up. It is horrifying. You got to gas yourself up to like type in that phone number. I get it. But also one, you will probably get sued if you do not do your due diligence in getting the comments and making sure that you're getting those statements or giving them the chance to speak. Especially when it comes to lawsuits or charges or things like that, or where like someone's critiquing a politician, it's like, well, yeah, you got to give the politician a chance to respond. And so I think that's kind of like where it kind of gets confusing of like, what is objectivity? It's like, yes, or what is fairness? Yes, you should still be reaching out to all of these politicians, and you can't really just assume they're gonna lie before they tell the lie. And then when they do tell you the lie, you write, they lied, right? You put it in there and you say, they said this, or they, said a lie about this, whatever, however you want to write it. I'm a writer, not a talker, so excuse me. But I think it's so hard to mix up that idea of like, okay, well, I don't have to, tell both sides because objectivity is no longer a thing. Whereas fairness is giving them a chance to either defend their position, to comment on whatever critique or protest is going on against them, and giving them that space, but not letting it go unchecked, I think is the key to this conversation. It's like, yeah, he's going to tell you the lie, but you're not going to put it up there for everyone to see without any context, clarity, or fact checking. Anyway, I'm going to shut up now.
Yeah. And I think also too, no, we love hearing from you. I think also too, it's important for students to know that like part of what we're doing is information gathering, right? And if we're in the business of doing that, like we can't assume we know. Like I often tell my students that, humility is it's like one of the most important, it is like, nope, it's everyone's brand, right? But no, actually humility and curiosity are kind of the most important things to me, because you need to know that you don't know, and that you need to want to know, right? Because if we don't ask the question, you don't know what you're going to get, right? And also too, humility is important too. I think sometimes when I think about our sense of rightness, I tell students that, you know, in the 1960s, we Americans were, you know, Nelson Mandela was on a terrorist list. He was a terrorist. People would have told you that. Now we look at Nelson Mandela. He's like, you know, one of the amazing statesmen of the century, right? So let's not be so sure that we know, and you know, and take the step, right? It's just really important to what we do. Okay, so it's 6:45. It looks like we've got 14 questions. So let's take them, and let's see. We'll have our panelists ask them. Okay, here's someone who's asking a question that I think, Yara, you tried to speak to a little bit here. How do you avoid false equivalency when trying to present both sides of an issue?
Yes.
Is that where you're kind of talking about the checking, you know?
Yes, 100%. Because for example, I learned through examples. So I'm just going to give you an example. We did this story on Alabama legislation that restricted. I've been really into the anti-trans laws lately. Sorry, that's what I keep going to. But an Alabama piece of legislation that restricted trans care for youth. And essentially, a lot of the legislation could all be debunked by physicians. And so in that sense, I was like, okay, well, how do I handle this, right? How do I unpack this without giving a platform to the misinformation? And the entire article was healthcare providers in Alabama debunk legislation. And so we went through step by step to talk about, okay, why is this wrong? How is it wrong? And so it's still, you know, and we reached out to politicians about like, why do you believe this? You know, where did you get your information from? And then we had that kind of dialogue where we could do that checking, we could do that fact finding. And then again, we still did give them an option to respond to the criticism, to the debunking. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it kind of gives a little bit of perspective to like, okay, here are both sides. We gave both sides, but we did that kind of extra due diligence of like, here's how they're not equal. Because again, one was full of lies, and so they're not equal in that way. Yeah, I hope that explains it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we've got another one. Sometimes I think a lot, something I think about a lot is that sometimes race culture units, departments, make an understanding of race and culture and history in other areas, other departments, unnecessary or invisible. How can we change that to make sure that there is cultural competence in every story? Cody?
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind is Vox Media's race and culture unit. I forget the exact name of the unit. It is now defunct, but one thing is with the case of Vox, what would happen is they would all race and culture stories, and they would never really work on other articles outside of that. And that's very dangerous to me, where you have people who have that training or at least a little bit of extra knowledge on certain area topics, and they're not necessarily going to other journals, or other journals aren't going to them for, hey, is this the right way to be approaching this, or how can I make sure that I have a sense of cultural competency in this article? The other thing is that it kind of limits a reporter's identity to solely race and culture or one specific siloed identity, when one thing to really be mindful of is we have so many intersecting identities, color, or you can be queer, man, whatever it is. But if you're siloed into one specific of, you are the black journalist or you are the queer reporter, whatever it is, that limits and also makes it so we don't really have that nuance to angles.
This
Can I
is
jump in on
so
that too?
challenging. Yeah, please, Benita.
So I work in the race and culture unit, and it's the exact opposite of that. So the CBS News Race and Culture unit works throughout the entire network, through every platform there is, including everything under the Paramount umbrella. We read every script that comes in to make sure that it's fair, it doesn't have any bias or any kind of things that will get us sued or anything like that. But we also are an incubator. We produce our own stories that are for our streaming network. Therefore, our network on TV. I'm working on a show with BET called America in Black. So we don't just do the Black stories or the, whatever your background is stories. We do stories that are fit the gamut. They go for everything. So, for women, for men, for disability. We have a website called the cbsnews.com/CBS Village that I manage, where we that's our library for all of our stories like that. So we work to make sure that those stories that are in someone's text message thread with their group chat, and those stories that, when you go home to mom and she's old fashioned, she's talking about, that those stories are the stories that we're covering, and that we're not falling into that trap of, oh, they're racing culture, so they're only going to do that one story over there about the person that got shot. No, we're going to do the positive story too. And it's not just going to be the Black stories or the Latinx stories. They're going to be stories from everyone and for everywhere. So that might have been a Fox News thing, but a lot of the networks, and I know ABC too, we're doing everything. We are not just like, oh, we just do these one types of things. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, and that's, I feel like, the goal of where we should be heading into the DEI space, right? And for me, I see NBC, I see ABC really setting the standard of what we can do and where we can grow into that space. I like to consider kind of your stage 1 and 2. Stage 1 of DEI and journalism was really focusing on numbers and numerical diversity. And now it's, how do we focus on creating communities of inclusion, right? Like, where it's not just in our reporting, but also how do we make a culture company-wide or newsroom-wide where people feel comfortable doing that, and that way you're able to mitigate low retention rates or burnout in your staff, because you feel supported and you have the resources.
To the student and to Cody, I think like those concerns are real, and what Chiara and Bonita are talking about are efforts where to make sure that doesn't happen. But the concerns, and I think it's Usha who asked the question, the concerns are real, like and journalists wrestle with this, like, will I be pigeonholed if I focus on this area? If people say like, oh, well, she's writing about the Black community, we're going to tap her on the shoulder to cover the White House? There has been a history of these kinds of units that does it kind of ease the weight on other departments to kind of make sure that they got they're consulting with diverse sources, that they're kind of doing a range of stories, reaching out to various communities. So it is something that I think as an industry we have wrestled with. Let's see. Okay, here's one. When an opinion involves harm, erasure, or danger, how do you keep an objection to yourself? I'm very openly supportive of unions, gun control, LGBTQ folks, scientific honesty, etc., because it seems wrong not to be on the side of people I love. How do you navigate that? This is the kind of question that's like, just, some of my students this year, like, we're like, but I feel this so strongly. Like, how can, are you guys in journalism, are these industry, the organizations, are they muzzling me,
No, but it's your personal life. So it's like you personally feel all those things and you feel very strongly, but you're in your work life now. So it's like you take your personal hat off and you put on your work hat. And in your work hat, you're a fair journalist who can talk about all of these different things and who can interview all these different people. And then when you leave, you put back on your personal hat. And when you talk to your friends, you go, OMG, I can't believe I talked to this person over here and they talked about all these, this, that, and the third things. But that's what you talk about at brunch. not while you're at work. At work, you keep it, you hold it in, and you tell a fair story.
I think that's traditionally been obviously the way we've done it. I feel like this younger generation, as our questioner asked, are questioning that.
Okay, again, a lot of thoughts. I feel like if you believe in something, I'd say I'm going to pick one thing out. Let's say gun control, because that's what we've done a lot at ABC. We had a whole series on it. If you believe in something, try to find the stories within that how do I want to explain this? I guess the thing with gun violence or unionization, no, okay, sorry. I'm like blabbing. Okay, I'm going to think about, economic injustice. And, I'm very passionate about that, and no one should be going hungry in this country. That is a very thing I think we can all agree with, right? And so one of the things that I started to do is more of like a service journal, or not service, like solutions journalism kind of angle on things of like, okay, well, what are people doing to fix economic injustice? And so I've done a lot of reporting on like guaranteed income and looking at the numbers and like, how does guaranteed income work? Does it work? Does it not work? Looking at that through the data and through the facts. Or, let's say gun control. It's like, okay, well, what has worked? What isn't working? What is the legislation that I can cover? What are the data points that are coming out that I can talk about? And looking at, use those passions to, again, seek out the stories and find the numbers, find the data, find the stories that can help others dissect this issue that we're having, because you're, again, not the only person who's openly supportive of these things. But I think it's just finding ways to unpack it, again, with that journalist hat on of like, okay, well, how do I dissect this in a way that is fair, in a way that focuses on facts and numbers.
Okay. Benita, a question for you. It says, you say it's important to you to be in the middle. Does that mean no matter how extreme and unhinged one side gets, you'll tack in their direction in order to not take sides? Further, I would say that since the two parties have such radically different realities, it's effectively impossible to be in the middle. It means you end up enabling both sides and failing to tell the public what it needs.
Interesting question. I don't know if I agree with the last half of it, but interesting for sure. You don't always have to go to the most radical person when telling both sides of the story. As I mentioned before, a lot of these organizations, even like the ones you wouldn't think, they have PR person. Like I did a story recently on CRT, and I talked with the Heritage Foundation. They are very conservative. They think that like books involving people of color should like mostly be banned, etc. And I dealt with their PR person, who was a lovely lady, who got me the person I needed for my interview. And it didn't turn into, anything. Our correspondent did the interview because I'm a producer. They did the interview. It did get combative, but we wanted to show that that was what their thoughts were. That was their feelings on it. And we shared that. And then we also went to the other side and we talked to Dr. Ibram Kendi, who has had books banned. So you can tell both sides of a story. And that's just one example of people, organizations who are actively trying to stop books from being out there, and authors and professors who are saying they feel the exact opposite way. We spoke with Nicole Hammond-Jones for the same piece. Similar, you're able to get both point of views into a story and still be fair without, going overly extreme on either way. I don't know if that answered the question, but hopefully.
Okay, thank you. I had a question here about conflicts of interest. Let me see. Could you scroll myself back up. Has there been an experience where you found that you had a conflict of interest in a story and had to turn away from a story? She's asking. Anyone? While you guys are thinking, this was not a race specific question issue to the student who's asking, but you know, when I was a reporter in Florida, there was a city council race. It was not an area that I really covered very much. It was Miami Beach, and it wasn't even a city council race. It was something having to do with the mayor. And I had again, not my area. Maybe there was a legal angle to it because I covered courts and stuff like that. And I knew the mayor's son, who had become a friend. And I realized that I actually could not really and should not really be writing about this mayor. You know, again, this isn't kind of an objectivity, but it is actually, it does speak to objectivity. Like I felt like I would be in the back of my head thinking about my friend and I'm writing about his dad, and that was not an appropriate, like I should not be doing that story. I don't know if any of you have any other examples like that. I think any other thoughts there? Okay, let's move on. Okay, another question, students wanting to put us on the spot. Could you share an example of a difficult decision you had to make in your work relating to objectivity and how you went about that situation? Anyone? Kiara, I see you leaning in.
It's one of those questions where I'm like, am I allowed to answer this? I'm like, I don't know if I'm gonna get in trouble for it. I'll try to be as vague as possible. I think there are just some times, like throughout my career, where I really had to defend whatever pitch I was working on. And typically, again, I, work from an identity lens. So whether that's, looking at, a police brutality incident from, the perspective of, someone mentioned later, events involving Black women and the discrimination that Black women face, and unconscious bias against Black women, or, trying to find those angles where I focus on identity. I just feel like when you're coming from that perspective, in any newsroom, you really have to work to like defend why and why you're coming at it from this angle and how you're going to back it up. Because a lot of these things, like let's say, for example, the adultification of Black girls, when you're coming at it from this angle and looking at a specific situation, you can be like, okay, well, how do I know that that's what happened here? And so it's a lot of like trying to figure out like, okay, this might be a really great idea for an angle, but now it's like, okay, how do I prove these kind of more fluid ideas about race and our understanding of biases. So I think it's less about like I guess it's about objectivity in the way of like how our newsrooms work and how you have to sell a pitch that looks at a specific race or a specific issue. But I think that's one thing I worked through, and it's always just, defend your edits. If you're going to say something, you got to back it up with like however many statistics, however many voices, however many experts that you need to get it through. But if your pitch is worth it, you will probably find a way. So always defend your work.
Okay. Okay. Can you speak to the misogynist? I'm sorry, oops, moved around. You speak to the misogynism and colorism in the field of journalism with regards to who gets to report stories. In addition, speak to the bias and the lack of a full and accurate reporting of events involving Black women or women in particular. So thoughts about misogyny and colorism in the industry. Don't be shy. We're journalists. We got to show we can answer. We can ask tough questions. We can answer tough questions.
I think with what was her name? Gabby Petito, the girl who, yes, we all know who I'm talking about.
Missing.
Yes, the white woman who went missing, and she became national news almost instantly, it felt like. And I feel like that was one of the first examples. And race and culture, obviously we focus on these issues all the time, but I feel like that was like one of the first times that I noticed everyone was like, oh, if this was a Black woman, we probably would not be on this story in the way that we are. And so I feel like ever since then, our newsrooms and a lot of newsrooms have been, really working to tackle that unconscious bias of like, okay, well, this Black woman was killed in Mexico. We have to focus on this, and femicide, or like looking at all of these different issues that we're seeing all over the place, and making sure that we give them the same due diligence and the same story arc that we would do for Gabby Petito, making sure that we're, circling back to those. I feel like in terms of speaking to it, yeah, I guess that's what race and culture teams are for. We're holding everyone accountable, and hopefully one day, we won't need a race and culture team to hold everyone accountable in the same ways, right? We can just do our work without having to watch everyone very closely. But we're working on it.
I would say, speaking to the question. Oh, go ahead, Cody. Go ahead.
Oh, this may not be just, but at the same time as Gabby Petito, Raja McQueen also went missing around the same time, and yet I believe there was only 1 or 2 articles ever published, and they were only with local reach and mostly via social media. So that's kind of where you can also, in addition of, hey, we should be covering these things, being critical not just of our own stories, but also, hey, editors for organization I work for, why are you choosing these stories and highlighting this, especially in terms of broadcast where we have a limited runtime, where you have 1 hour, how are you going to fill it? Why are we doing this in multiple hours in here and not looking?
Yeah. In terms of the question about colorism, I think certainly I've heard from, in terms of, women, I've heard from, colleagues of mine, darker skinned women who talk about this, who say that there is, this exists. It exists in America. It exists in our newsrooms. I think things have been, well, look at TV, right? And look around. I mean, it's, we can see it. I would say things are changing some. Look at my hair today. Okay. I think there's a little more room for Black women to be kind of our fuller selves than there used to be. There's actually had to be like legislation in some places saying that, you can't lose your job if you decide to wear your hair natural, straighten it, or you're wearing braids or stuff like that. So those kinds of things are happening. But you're not the only person who looks around and asks that questions. There are journalists who look around and ask that question too. Let's see.
Sorry,
Go
one
ahead.
quick thing.
Yeah.
And this isn't just extend to our reporting, but also how are we visualizing things? Being on the
That's
technical side of
right. That's a
broadcast,
very good.
like in addition to on camera and also behind the camera having representation, the amount of times I see deep or dark skinned women not lit or men too, not lit properly in broadcast studios. Often we're told, oh, it's hard to change from our rep plot of a studio look. It's going to change the format of a show. No, this is, you actually can influence public perception of credibility if lighting is not set up. And we should not be we should not be afraid to sacrifice the quality of looks and aesthetics of a show in order to make as much accommodation for different melanated skin tones and lighting. and that in itself is a form of discrimination.
I think that I'm so glad that you talked about that, because I think sometimes we're talking a lot about, of course, journalism and but images and just the lighting. That's fascinating. That images are so powerful in journalism, and how we present people is really powerful. It's often come up too, just for instance, how we present folks who are arrested, right? And whether the kid who is arrested in a black kid in a police brutality, is it a mugshot that's presented, or is it the kid with his mom that's presented? So all of those are. Thank you so much, Cody, for bringing that up. I think we're going to take one last question. See which one that will be, and then we're going to wrap it up. Done. So actually, and this is a good one to wrap it up. It says, the question is, how do you define objectivity? And it seems as if the three panelists have different definitions. And it's interesting. Sometimes we're talking about objectivity. Sometimes we're talking about fairness. We're talking about accuracy. I don't know, maybe you can think of, if each of you could say kind of what it means to you and what matters to you in thinking about this issue as a journalist.
I think mine would be like a freedom from bias. It's being in the middle. It's going with the facts and not with my own personal thoughts or opinions.
Okay.
I
Cody?
know for me, I like to separate. I think of objectivity separate from neutrality. Objectivity to me is doing your due diligence and making sure that you're doing as much as you can to make all aspects of your story well rounded, and that you're doing as much as you can for the benefit of the story.
Okay, Kiara? You're gonna go with fairness?
Yeah, well, it's tough. So when I say like I don't go for objectivity, I go for fairness. I think objectivity in the traditional sense has looked at both sidism or neutrality in the lens of white of a predominantly white, predominantly male newsroom. And so that's why my mind goes to fairness rather than objectivity, is because for so long those are the voices that were uplifted, those were the voices that gave mugshots instead of actual photos, that haven't been lighting people, the way that they should be lit, or that haven't been covering other stories, or that haven't been giving a voice to marginalized communities and prioritizing, official or established departments, jurisdictions, agencies, etc. And so that's what I think of when I think of objectivity, is this idea of traditional journalism of, here are the two sides of the debate. There you go. Do what you will with it. And so I think fairness is probably more close to what Cody and Bonita are saying about doing the due diligence, being, having the facts, checking someone if they're telling lies, making sure that we're not platforming misinformation and hate unchecked, make sure that we are uplifting the voices of marginalized communities, especially when talking about those abuses, making sure that those voices are there. And, I guess in terms of fairness, it's like these communities have been left without a voice, or without their voices being platformed for so long. So giving a lot of weight to those is just very important to me. So,
Yeah.
One
sorry.
thing that comes to mind is
Go ahead, Cody.
equitable coverage, giving the affordances of. One thing that actually came in the Q&A that I've totally agreed with was, I feel like we get caught in journalism in this mindset or framework of there are two sides, but there's more than that. There's an infinite number of sides and impact that a single
Complexity.
issue
Life is so
may have.
complex.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
approaching things with nuance and equitability in mind of, again, how am I fair in my coverage, and also like what distribution of, okay, what am I spotlighting, whatnot. So definitely agree with.
All right. Okay, well, thank you all so very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. We want to encourage all of you to go out and report rigorously, to be curious, to hear as many people and as many voices as you can. We look forward to seeing all the great work that you're going to be producing. Thank you all so very much, and we'll see you next time. Keep an eye out for our programming for the Diversity Committee in Journalism, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Take care.